So who is Dosan Ahn Chang? I think if you're going to know a Korean American, he's definitely one that you want to know a little bit more about. And so where can we find some information? We can go to the Korean American Studies Education Foundation website, ksef.org, go to lesson number 2, and there's all these lesson plans. But in addition to that, there's a PowerPoint at the very bottom, which I'm going to be sharing out on. So I'm going to go ahead and click here where it says presentation mode. And we're going to be talking about Dosan Ahn Chang and the first Korea town. So if you were to go actually to Riverside today, you can even see this statue, the Dosan Ahn Chang Memorial Statue. It's alongside kind of this peace walk in Riverside, which is wonderful because you can also learn about Mahatma Gandhi. You can learn about Cesar Chavez and other civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, all in this place, and you can see the connections and intersections between these great folks. And I'm hoping to even have a field trip here one day where my students will have a chance to go and learn about all these different civil rights leaders who made a difference for the United States. So who is Dosan Ahn Chang? First of all, he was a Korean independence activist. So there was a time period in Korea where Korea was colonized, and it wasn't a short period. It was from 1910 to 1945, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But he was definitely one of the early leaders also of the Korean American community in the United States. So when I say Dosan Ahn Chang, a lot of people in Korea actually know who he is, but a lot of Korean Americans don't know who he is. So today we're gonna have a chance to talk about that a little bit. First of all, he was born in 1878, Gangso County, Pyongyang Province, which is actually modern-day North Korea. So this is before the division of Korea, because for 1,000 years, Korea was one nation, but today there's a North and a South, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But he immigrates to the United States in 1902, and so when he comes actually with his wife, Helen Lee, or Helen, to pursue better education, they're actually Dosan Ahn Chang and Helen become the first Korean American married couple to come from Korea to the United States. So for a lot of Asian Americans that were coming to the United States during this time, oftentimes it was men. And that's because of the Page Act, which I'm not going to talk about, but which excluded actually a lot of women coming from Asia. And so many of the Asian American communities during this time were bachelor communities, all men. But what's very unique about the Korean American community is they were men and women who had families. And once he comes here, like, it's not that he's just, living for himself. He creates spaces to build community, like building a friendship society called the Chinmok in 1903, organized for Koreans to gather together, to fellowship, to support each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So if I say the first Korean American community was in Riverside, it was at Pachappa Camp, does that surprise anybody? I mean, it surprised me when I first heard it, because I go like, why Riverside, right? So once again, this was during a time of high anti-Asian racism. And I mean, even you could look at 2020 today, we saw that surge in anti-Asian racism as well. That's like very recent, but that's not something new. That's something that has been a part of this country. In fact, in 1882, before Dosan Ahn Chang came, Chinese Americans were excluded through the Chinese Exclusion Act. So in order to have an act like that happen, you can imagine the anti-Asian attitudes all throughout the country. But, there just seemed to be some opportunities in Riverside. And a big part of that was due to the citrus industry. Yeah, like oranges, right? So there in Riverside, many Korean Americans, Dosan Ahn Chang, worked as migrant farm workers doing domestic work, cooking, cleaning, and also picking oranges. And they saw this as very patriotic work. And if they did a good job, it was representing who Koreans were in a good way. That's what Dosan shared in his community. And these agricultural workers were hired as labor contractors all throughout Riverside and surrounding areas. And in April of 1905, Dosan opened the Korean Employment Labor Bureau as a labor contractor and helped facilitate for Koreans to come and work. And many people hired them because they worked very well. So the reputation of Korean immigrants in Riverside was very good. Their work was very good. And that was in part due to Dosan Ahn Chang and the first Korean American community, which was called Pachappa Camp. Pachappa Camp existed between 1905 to 1913. It's one of the very first organized Korean settlements. It was founded by Dosan Ahn Chang. Some people say that it was also called Dosan's Republic because it was self-governing, organized and run by communities. And once again, most Asian American communities during this time were bachelor communities, but this was a family-based community. And when I say self-governing in the United States, like a republic, many people could resonate with that because the United States is a democracy. It's a constitutional republic. However, if you think about Korea's history and where Dosan Ahn Chang is coming from, they had, there's the Koryo dynasty, Shilla dynasty, Joseon dynasty. So for, a long time, it was not a democracy. It was more of a monarchy, you should say. And so you can see why this is special. In this community, Dosan Ahn Chang is creating space for people to work together and run it together, including women. So even before women in the United States had the right to vote, 1920, during women's suffrage, even before that, women's suffrage for all Americans in the Pachappa Camp, Korean American women at Pachappa Camp could vote early on. That's what the record shows. So you can see this very progressive thinking during this space. And I'm not saying Korea had that same kind of perspective because of the Confucian society in Korea, but Pachappa Camp, you can see, was a very unique kind of place. And you can see Dosan Ahn Chang influencing and also being influenced by this space. In 1905, once again, continuing to form these organizations where Koreans are not just living individually, but helping one another, like the Gongnip Hyopyo, the cooperative organization, headquartered in San Francisco. And once again, it's promoting democracy and ultimately the desire to have a democratic Korea. And you're going to see why that could be really difficult actually for Korea, because between 1910 to 1945, you could say Korea was a colonized nation by that point. And so the idea of even independence was something that many people dreamed about in Korea. Many people suffered under that colonization. And then, of course, I mentioned how before that, it was a monarchy. So a monarchy is not a democracy, once again. So here he is promoting democracy. This is a big place. So if you went to Pachappa Camp in 1907, you're not going to see like thousands and thousands of people. It's a small group, maybe 200 residents. But nonetheless, this is a very, very significant and important place for Korean Americans and then also Koreans in Korea. My understanding is Dr. Ed Chang actually found this map of the first Koreatown in Pachappa Camp in Riverside, California. And so you can see on this map how there's Pachappa Road and this area where it says the Pachappa settlement or the Korean settlement. So what was life for citrus pickers during that time? So if we were to kind of research a little deeper, then we could see like the stories of different groups. And actually there are articles here of what it was like for Mexican citrus pickers and also women who were in this industry. And then what you're going to see here is as you read those articles, as we're going to do in my class, you're going to see like how, wow, there's a lot of like similar, and there's some differences too, of course, but there's a lot of similarities between Koreans, women, Mexicans in the citrus industry between 1900 and 1930. And this is important because I think it helps to build empathy and understanding between different groups. So, of course, they're working very hard in the citrus industry, making money, and then donating actually a lot of it back to Korea for Korea's independence. So people in Korea, they very much respect Dosan Ahn Chang-ho's work. So Dosan and other Koreans in 1909 created the Korean National Association. The goal was to promote Korean independence from Japan, and chapters were established all across the United States and Mexico. And you can see Dosan traveling from one place to another place to promote Korean independence. Once again, in 1910 to 1945, Korea becomes a colonized nation. They are not independent. And so this work of remembering who Korea is becomes so important outside of Korea, you see. Outside of Korea, because in Korea, you're going to find that it was difficult to remain Korean. So in 1913, Ahn moves to Los Angeles, and in 1919, he's going to help establish the Korean provisional government in Shanghai, China. So once again, why Shanghai, China? Because you can't be Korean in Korea. It's a colonized nation. The idea of a Korea has to exist outside of Korea. And we're going to talk about how he gets to Shanghai as well in just a little bit. So once again, what was Dosan fighting for? In addition to Korean Americans here in the United States and building a community and a living wage and fighting against racism, in 1910, Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan. And after years of war intimidation, politics, it would be considered a part of Japan until 1945. So if you were in Korea during this time, you could not speak Korean. You'd be worshiping religions that were not a part of Korea. You would be given a Japanese name. You could be forced to work. And there's all kinds of other atrocities, which I'm not going to go into detail on this slide. But it was very difficult to be Korean in Korea. Maybe people in Korea were maybe asking that same question as many of our young people. Who am I? Who am I? So, so in order to control the area, you could say that Japan waged an all-out war against Korean culture. And if you promoted Korean independence or culture, it was very brutally quashed, you could say. So you could say you have to be pretty courageous to enter these spaces and promote Korean independence. And Dosan Ahn Chang does that, which is why even today people in Korea really respect what he's done. So how did he get to Shanghai once again? How does he get out of the United States? So he's in the United States initially, and I would say it's not very easy even to be in the United States at this time. Because if you remember in 1882, I talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It takes a lot for, I think, a country to say, hey, this group of people, this whole group of people from this entire nation cannot be a part of our country. They can't even come to this country, right? And then in 1907, with the Gentleman's Agreement Act that applies to Japanese. And then by 1924, pretty much, if you're a person from Asia, you cannot come to the United States. So that's other countries, right? So what about Asian Americans in the United States? Well, it was hard for them too, because they couldn't become citizens. It was difficult to buy property. You couldn't testify very easily in court. You couldn't vote. And there wasn't a path to citizenship. So you can imagine if you were in the United States and you weren't a citizen, how difficult that would be as an Asian American during this time. So I would say it gets even worse. So even though the Chinese Exclusion Act passes in 1882, I wouldn't say it gets better in the United States for a long, long time. And so I think Asian Americans benefit greatly from other groups who are also fighting for civil rights, including African Americans and the civil rights movement. But that's not going to be all the way till, I guess, 1964. So before that, there's all kinds of racism and discrimination that is not just happening, but is legal, right? So let's go back to Dosan Ahn Chang and what happens to him. So someone writes this anonymous letter and they say that pretty much he's like a communist, like a Bolshevik. And so in 1924, he gets deported from the United States outside of our country. And actually, if you look at his, and we have some documents on the kind of questions he was asked, it did not look like that. But nonetheless, you can see how easily a person in this country could be sent outside of this country. So he was investigated and interrogated by the Department of Immigration in 1925. And once again, this is right after the Immigration Act of 1924, which excludes Asians from coming to the United States. So you could see the vibe in our country at that time. And then he's deported, leaving his family in the United States. So he's deported in 1926. His family continues to remain in America because remember, he was the first couple, the first Korean-American couple to the United States. So this first Korean-American couple gets separated. So he's forced to leave. And I can't imagine how crushing that would be. But what does he do? He continues to promote Korean independence. What's going to happen to him at that point? Well, then now he's going to be accused of anti-Japanese activities. So as he's sent to China in 1932. He's arrested in China, and then he's extradited to Korea. So he's sent to Korea. But remember, Korea during this time, 1910 to 1945, is a colony of Japan. So it's not exactly Korea. It's like Japan, you could say. And so he was convicted at that place in Japan of, I guess, violating Japan's preservation of peace laws and sentenced to 5 years in Tehran prison. Now, this isn't, when you think of prisons, I think prisons are tough places wherever you are. But this was not any ordinary prison. This is a prison where you can get tortured and abused, and he was tortured and abused to the point where they thought, you know what, I think Dosan Ahn Chang can die in prison. I think he could die. So they release him a little early. But what happens to Dosan Ahn Chang? He actually does die. So he goes to the hospital, Korean National University Hospital, and he dies from his injuries of being tortured while in prison. So in a certain sense, it's a little bit of a sad story, right? It's this Korean American, where it's saying, yeah, let's remember him, first Korean American community, first Korean American couple, supported with the independence work in Korea. But you could see that it kind of has a little bit of in a certain sense, a sad ending. But nonetheless, you could see the legacy moving on. First of all, the legacy in his children, because I did mention about Helen and how their first couple, they did end up having 5 children: Philip, Philson, Susan, Sora, and Ralph. And once again, this is during the time where there's so few. This is the first wave of Korean Americans. There are less than 5,000 Korean Americans in the United States during this time, because soon thereafter, Asians were excluded from coming to the United States. So it's a very small group, but that small group does great things. And his children also do great things, including Philip, Ralph, Susan were in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, so serving their country, even though during this time there are so many laws in place that were made it difficult for people of color. And nonetheless, this Korean American Korean American story is a story of resilience. Susan Nankari was the first female gunnery officer in the United States Navy. So not just first Korean American, but first female gunnery officer, period, in the U.S. Navy. And then Philip Ahn becomes an actor. So even today, think about it. How many Asian American actors do we know, Korean American actors? I know today there's more, definitely more than when I was a child. But can you imagine even during this time, there at least we had this very few. So I think there's even a star on Hollywood for Philip Ahn. Some other legacies, including now a recognition of this story. So you might have passed by some of these places, like you go, oh wow, the Dosan Ahn Chang Memorial Interchange Highway, like it's named after him, or that memorial that I mentioned at the very beginning, and I hope that we have a chance to visit and think about in context with other civil rights leaders in America that helped us to become more of we the people. So I hope that helps us to understand a little bit more about Dosan Ahn Chang, his significance in America as Korean American, but also for all Americans as an example of what it means to build a republic. It's a story that America can be proud of too, because the idea of the republic and democracy that is instilled in Dosan Ahn Chang is not forgotten. Even when deported out of our own country, he wants that kind of democracy and freedom for Korea. And so when you looked at Korea, eventually what you're going to see is you're going to see a democratic Korea as well. That's not going to happen for some time, because 1910 to 1945, Korea is a colonized nation. Then 1950 to 1953, Korea is going to become divided in a great civil war. Imagine the United States. We also had a civil war where we're divided between the North and South. But imagine if we stayed divided, the scar that would be in place, and that scar continues to remain in Korea between 1950 to 1953. These two nations now separated, though together for so long. Many family separations, husbands with wives and children and so forth. So this has caused all kinds of, I'm sure, though not talked about, intergenerational trauma in the Korean history, but also the Korean American story as well. And then the miracle on the Han. After 1953, today, Korea becoming one of the most prosperous nations in the world, one of the top GDP nations in the world, and a democratic nation, and in a space where there's not as many democratic nations in that area of Asia, but Korea is a thriving democracy, and even though it's been challenging in the last, I would say, past couple of weeks, some updates that have happened, it seems as though the people really value their republic, their democracy as well, and so they're speaking up. So what a powerful legacy for Dosan Ahn Chang. It's a great Korean American story for Korean Americans, all Americans, and it's also a really interesting Korean story as well. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about Dosan Ahn Chang, an amazing Korean American.